Robb Stark had always prided himself on protecting his family, and the news of Arya's capture by the Lannisters weighed heavily on his heart. When he received word that Arya had been taken to Harrenhal, he knew that it would be a dangerous and perilous rescue mission, but one he could not avoid. The war between the North and the South was already raging, but for Robb, his family came first, and the thought of Arya alone in the hands of their enemies tormented him. The time had come to act. With his army marching through the lands of the Riverlands, Robb decided to make a bold move. He dispatched a small group of his most trusted men, including Jon Snow and a few loyal Stark bannermen, to accompany him on a secret mission to Harrenhal. Robb had no intention of confronting the Lannisters directly in the castle, knowing it would be a fool's errand. Instead, he sought to be clever. He knew that Harrenhal was a vast and ruined fortress, with many secret passages and hidden corridors. His plan was to slip in unnoticed, find Arya, and escape without the Lannisters ever knowing they were there. As they approached the shadowy silhouette of Harrenhal on the horizon, Robb felt a deep sense of foreboding. The air around the castle was thick with an oppressive tension, and he could feel the weight of his father's legacy bearing down on him. It was hard not to be reminded of how his father had been captured by the Lannisters in King's Landing, and how he himself had been forced to face the war alone. But this was different. Robb was not going to let his sister suffer the same fate. As night fell, Robb's group made their move, slipping past the castle's outer defenses, relying on their stealth and knowledge of the land. They reached the gates of Harrenhal undetected. The moonlight barely pierced the darkness, giving the men the perfect cover. Robb and Jon led the way, their steps silent as they moved toward the entrance. The air was heavy with the smell of rotting wood and old stone, remnants of the ruined fortress. They crept through the castle's massive halls, avoiding patrols and staying to the shadows. The place felt as haunted as it looked, with its dilapidated walls and eerie silence. They passed through dark corridors, each turn taking them closer to Arya's location. Robb's heart raced, but he remained focused. He knew that his sister's life depended on his ability to remain calm and calculated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the dungeons. The cold stone walls and damp air made it clear they had found the right place. Robb's men stood guard as he and Jon descended into the depths of the castle. They moved quickly, knowing they had little time before anyone noticed their absence. In the dim light of the dungeons, Robb's eyes scanned the cells. He could hear faint sounds of movement in the distance. He knew that Arya had been kept in the lower levels, and he was determined to get to her before it was too late. After a tense moment, they found the cell where Arya was held. Her face was pale and weary, but when she saw Robb, a flicker of recognition lit up her eyes. "Arya," Robb whispered urgently, reaching through the bars to grasp her hand. "We're here to get you out." Her eyes widened in disbelief at first, but then relief washed over her as she realized he was real. She had been through so much, and the sight of her brother standing before her gave her hope for the first time in months. "They've been treating me horribly," Arya said, her voice shaky. "I thought ... I thought you'd never come." Robb's face softened, and he gave her a reassuring smile. "I promised you, Arya, I would always protect you. Now let's get out of here." With his men standing guard, Robb and Jon quickly worked to unlock the cell door. They were taking every precaution to avoid making any noise that might alert the guards. Once the door was open, Robb stepped in and helped Arya to her feet. Her legs were weak from being confined for so long, but with Robb's support, she was able to stand. "Stay close," Robb instructed, as they began to make their way back through the winding corridors. The tension in the air was palpable. Every footstep seemed to echo in the silence, and every shadow looked like a potential threat. But Robb remained calm, determined to get his sister to safety. As they neared the outer gates of the castle, a shout suddenly pierced the night. Intruders! The alarm had been raised. The chase had begun. Robb's heart skipped a beat, but he did not falter. "We have to move now," he ordered. John and the others quickly formed a defensive perimeter around the group as they ran toward the gates. The sound of footsteps pounding behind them grew louder, but they were almost there. With one final push, they made it outside the walls of Harrenhal, where Robb's men were waiting with horses. "Go!" Robb commanded, helping Arya onto a horse. John and the others followed suit, and within moments they were galloping away from the cursed castle, leaving the chaos behind. The sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Robb could breathe again. Arya was safe. As they rode through the night, heading toward the safety of the Riverlands, Robb couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He had saved his sister, and in doing so, he had proven that family was always worth fighting for. But deep down, he knew that the war was far from over. The Lannisters would not let this escape go unpunished, and Robb's journey was far from finished. But for now, he had his sister back, and that was enough to keep his spirits high. The days following Arya's rescue from Harrenhal were tense. Robb Stark had hoped that the successful mission would be a victory for morale, a small triumph amid the war-torn landscape of Westeros. However, he could sense that it had only intensified the war in a way he hadn't anticipated. The Lannisters were enraged. Robb knew this wouldn't be a simple escape. The repercussions would be far-reaching. He had no doubt that Tywin Lannister would send his armies after them. His wrath now directed at the north. Robb and his men kept a steady pace, traveling by night to avoid detection. But even in the quiet moments, Robb couldn't silence the worries swirling in his mind. He had done what he could, and now Arya was safe. But what about the other members of his family? Catelyn was still in Riverrun, and Sansa, he feared, was likely still trapped in King's Landing, though the news had been sparse. The pieces of his family scattered across Westeros, all in different places, each in their own kind of peril. Arya, on the other hand, had shown a remarkable resilience. Despite everything she had endured in Harrenhal, she remained sharp and determined. Robb was impressed by how much his younger sister had grown, how she had adapted to the brutal circumstances forced upon her. She had grown beyond the little girl who had once playfully teased him in Winterfell. She was now someone who had tasted the harsh realities of the world. As they made their way further from Harrenhal, Robb decided that they needed to get Arya to safety before the Lannisters came for them. They couldn't afford to go back to Riverrun or even the camps with the bulk of Robb's army. It was too risky, and the risk of being discovered was far too high. Instead, Robb sought out the safe houses in the northern woods where they could hide for a time, regroup, and plan their next move. The woods were dense and wild, providing a decent hiding place for those who knew how to navigate its paths. Robb had always known these woods like the back of his hand. They had once been a place of peace for him, a sanctuary during childhood days when he would hunt and ride with his brothers. Now they would become their refuge. As they camped deep within the forest, Robb took the time to speak with Arya alone. She sat by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. Her eyes still carried the weight of all she had endured, but they sparkled with an undeniable fire. "How are you holding up?" Robb asked, lowering himself onto a nearby log. Arya glanced up at him, a smirk playing at her lips. "You mean besides being held prisoner, nearly starved, and surrounded by enemies? I'm doing just fine, Robb." Robb chuckled, appreciating the sarcasm. He reached out to ruffle her hair, though she swatted his hand away with a grin. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, shaking his head. "You're strong, Arya. I don't know how you made it through Harrenhal, but you did. That's something worth celebrating." Arya shrugged, her expression growing more somber. "It wasn't just strength. It was survival. You learn a lot when you have no choice but to survive." Robb nodded, understanding. "I know. It's not easy. I've been forced to make choices I never thought I would, and I've lost people I care about. This war, it changes everything." Arya didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She had seen how war had changed people, how it had hardened them. And she had become part of that change. As the night deepened and the fire crackled in the cold air, Robb found himself lost in thought. There was no peace for any of them. No matter how hard he fought, there were always new challenges, new threats. On the horizon, the Lannisters would never stop hunting them, and Robb had no doubt that Tywin would be relentless in his pursuit of his sister's capture. Meanwhile, the alliance with the Freys, fragile as it was, seemed more important than ever. Robb knew he needed to make peace with Lord Walder Frey, even though the man was known for his pride and tendency to act on whims. If he could secure the Freys' support in the coming months, he could hold the line against the Lannisters in the Riverlands. But everything had to be calculated, every move had to be part of a larger strategy. The game was growing more complex, and the stakes had never been higher. Jon Snow, ever the silent observer, was another concern. Robb knew Jon was an excellent fighter and a loyal friend, but Robb could sense that Jon was beginning to feel torn between his loyalty to the Starks and his growing allegiance to the Knights. Watch. Jon had always been conflicted about his place in the world, but the burden of leadership was beginning to settle on his shoulders. Robb wondered whether Jon would ever fully accept his role as a Stark, or if he would always see himself as an outsider, a member of the Night's Watch first and foremost. The paths of duty and blood often conflicted, and Robb knew his brothers. Future would depend on which path he chose. The nights spent hiding in the woods passed slowly. The tension in the air never eased, and Robb grew increasingly uneasy as each day passed without word from his bannermen or any signs of Lannister pursuit. Eventually, Robb's mind turned to Arya again. She had been through so much, and yet she still had the spark of the old Arya Stark in her. Robb was grateful for that, because as the days wore on, he knew he was relying on that same spark to keep them all going. The North was calling to him. But it was not just the war that would shape their futures. It was the choices they would make in the days ahead. As the days dragged on, Robb's concern for Arya and their safety grew, while the woods provided them with some semblance of security. It was clear that they couldn't remain hidden for long. The Lannisters would eventually find them, and they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. But for now, Robb allowed himself small moments of relief, knowing that Arya was with him again. Her presence brought comfort, even amidst the uncertainty of war. Yet the weight of the decisions ahead loomed large over him. One evening, after a long day of travel through the dense forest, Robb sat with Jon beside the fire, a rare moment of quiet between them. Jon had been his closest confidant, his brother in every way that mattered. Despite the complicated nature of Jon's identity, his friendship had always remained steadfast. "Do you think we can win this war?" Jon asked, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Robb sighed deeply, his eyes scanning the distant shadows of the woods. The question was one he had asked himself countless times. "I don't know. The Lannisters are powerful, Jon. Tywin Lannister controls the armies of the South, and he has all the resources. We have our honor, our courage, but sometimes that doesn't win wars." Jon shifted slightly, his tone more measured. "But we have the North. We have the support of our people, and the North will never bow to the Lannisters. If we fight for what's ours, we can win." Robb looked at him, appreciating the quiet confidence in his brother's voice. It's not just about the North anymore, John. It's about family. Arya's life, Sansa's safety, and what happens to Catelyn and our bannermen. This is bigger than the North. It's about the future of our family. And we can't afford to lose. John nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll follow you wherever. You lead, Robb. You know that. Robb smiled slightly. I know, John, but I need more than just soldiers. I need wisdom. We're fighting a war, but it's also a game. A game I'm not sure I'm winning. The fire crackled in silence, and for a moment, Robb felt the burden of leadership settle heavily on him. He was no longer just a young lord trying to protect his home. He was a king, a commander, and the future of his house rested on his shoulders. As the night deepened, Arya approached the campfire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. She was holding something in her hands, an old wooden dagger, its handle worn from use. She had taken to carrying the blade with her ever since her captivity at Harrenhal. Robb had noticed that she often practiced with it, honing her skills in silence, though he never asked her about it. She was fierce, and he respected her for it. Arya, Robb called softly, his voice breaking the silence. You're getting better. With that, she smirked, her eyes glinting with determination. You should see what I can do when I'm not being watched. Jon and Robb exchanged a brief look. They both knew Arya had become something of a force to be reckoned with. Robb couldn't help but feel pride in his sister's transformation. She had always been bold, but now she had learned to wield that courage like a weapon, tempered by experience. I'm glad you're here, Arya, Robb said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. You've shown me a lot about survival, more than I ever thought I could learn. Arya's expression softened for a moment, and she nodded. I'm not the same girl I was, Robb. I've seen things, done things, but I'm still your sister. I won't leave you. The words felt like a weight lifted from Robb's heart. He had always known that Arya was strong, but to hear her say it aloud made him realize just how much she had grown. In many ways, Arya had become the embodiment of everything he needed in this war. Fierce, unyielding, and loyal to the core, their moment of quiet was shattered when a rustling noise broke through the stillness of the night. Robb immediately stood, his hand reaching for his sword, his senses alert. Jon was already on his feet, his eyes scanning the woods. Stay close, Robb ordered, his voice low. Arya and Jon moved swiftly to position themselves at his side, their weapons ready. The threat wasn't immediate, but Robb had learned long ago to trust his instincts. The woods could be treacherous, and there was no telling if it was an enemy scout or something else lurking in the shadows. The noise grew louder, and soon the silhouette of a rider emerged from the trees. Robb's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a Lannister soldier or an enemy scout. This was someone he recognized. It was a rider from House Umber, one of the northern bannermen who had sworn loyalty to Robb's cause, Lord Stark. The rider called, his voice carrying relief. I've been searching for you. Calm yourself, Robb replied, his tone guarded. What news do you bring? The rider dismounted quickly and handed Robb a letter sealed with the Umber sigil. Robb broke the seal, his eyes scanning the hastily written message. The Lannisters are advancing, the rider reported. Tywin Lannister has moved his forces south, towards Riverrun. They are gathering to strike. We must act swiftly. Robb's heart sank. Tywin was making his move, and the window of opportunity to strike back was closing. He looked at Arya and Jon, his resolve hardening. The time for hiding was over. If he was going to protect his family and win this war, he would have to take the fight to the Lannisters. Arya, Jon, gather the men, Robb ordered. We ride at dawn. The war isn't over. We're going to make our stand. As they prepared for the march ahead, Robb couldn't help but feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. But for the first time in a long while, He felt a sense of purpose. His family was back together, and they would fight. To the end. The morning air was crisp and biting as Robb, Stark and his small band of loyal soldiers, prepared for what was to come. The urgency in the message from House Umber could not be overstated. Tywin Lannister had begun his march south, and Riverrun was vulnerable. Robb knew that time was no longer on their side. If he didn't act swiftly, the Lannisters would tighten their grip on the Riverlands, and the war would tip further out of his control dot. As they saddled their horses, Arya stood nearby, her dagger securely fastened at her side, her face resolute. Robb had always admired her courage, but now, as they prepared for battle, he found a different kind of strength in her. She had come a long way from the mischievous little sister he had once known. She was fierce, driven, and ready to fight. "Ready to ride, Arya?" Robb asked, strapping his own sword to his waist. His voice held a quiet urgency, but his gaze softened when he looked at her. Arya nodded without a word, her eyes sharp. She had said little since the messenger's arrival, but Robb could see the fire in her. She was ready for whatever lay ahead. Jon Snow, always the silent observer, was mounted on his horse beside Robb. "We'll make it to Riverrun in time," he said, his voice calm, but with a determined edge. "The Lannisters may be advancing, but we've got the advantage of speed." Robb nodded, but a nagging worry lingered in his mind. They were only a small force compared to the Lannisters' army. Despite their loyalty and determination, the odds were stacked against them. Yet Robb had learned, over the course of this brutal war, that he could not afford to hesitate. His father's lessons on honor and duty rang in his ears. But now, more than ever, he had to be the leader his people needed. "We'll need every bit of luck we can get," Robb replied, his gaze sweeping over the group. "But if we fight hard, and fight smart, we can hold Riverrun. We've got to defend it until reinforcements can arrive." The journey south was swift but perilous. The road was rough, and Robb's mind raced with strategies, plans, and what-ifs. The closer they got to Riverrun, the more the tension mounted. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig underfoot, had Robb's senses on edge. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard, not when so much was at stake. By the time they reached the outskirts of Riverrun, the light had faded from the sky, leaving behind the muted colors of dusk. The castle loomed in the distance, its imposing silhouette a symbol of the North's determination. Robb could see the lights flickering from within the castle walls, the signs of a place on high alert. "We'll enter through the eastern gate," Robb decided, pointing to a narrow pass that wound its way up to the castle. "It's the least expected route. We need to make sure we're not spotted before we strike." Jon, Arya, and the rest of the men nodded in agreement. It was a simple plan, but it was their best chance. As they made their way toward the gate, Robb's thoughts turned to his mother, Catelyn. She was a constant presence in his mind, her wisdom and fierce love guiding his every step. He hoped she was safe within Riverrun's walls, but he couldn't shake the sense of dread that gnawed at him. The Lannisters were relentless, and even in Riverrun there was no guarantee of safety. Suddenly, the distant sound of hooves reached their ears, low but unmistakable. Robb raised his hand, signaling for the group to stop. The last thing they needed was to be discovered before they had a chance to move in. Jon's expression hardened. "Lannister scouts, they're ahead." Robb's pulse quickened. They had to act now. Without hesitation, he gave the order to dismount. The group quickly melted into the shadows of the trees, their horses tethered and hidden. Robb and his men crouched low, barely breathing as the scouts passed by, oblivious to their presence. The Lannisters had no idea that they were so close. Now, Robb whispered, and they began to move quickly, staying low to the ground. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, but time was against them. The scouts might be the first of many, and it was only a matter of time before the entire Lannister army descended upon Riverrun dock as they reached the eastern gate. The guards on duty were focused on the horizon, unaware of the stealthy group approaching. Robb nodded to Jon, who unsheathed his sword and signaled for the others to follow suit. Quietly, Robb ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We take them out swiftly." The men moved with precision. Jon struck first, his sword cutting through the air with deadly accuracy. A guard crumpled to the ground before he could even cry out. The others followed, each strike swift and clean, until all the guards lay motionless at their feet. Robb took a deep breath, his heart racing. They had gained access to the gate, but the risk was far from over. "Get the drawbridge down," Robb ordered. Arya, with her quick reflexes, was the first to climb the stairs leading to the mechanism that controlled the gate. Within moments, heavy drawbridge creaked open, allowing them access to the castle's inner defenses. They moved quickly through the gates, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Robb's eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of the Lannister army. It wouldn't be long before they realized their scouts were missing, and then they would come looking for Robb and his group. Inside the castle, the air felt heavier, more oppressive. Robb knew that Riverrun was not just a fortress. It was a symbol of resistance against the Lannisters. If they could hold it, they could strike a blow to the heart of Tywin's campaign. But holding it would require more than just a small force. Would require unity, preparation, and resolve. The gates had been breached, and now it was up to Robb and his men to turn Riverrun into a bastion of defense. As the last of the group entered, Robb turned back toward Arya and Jon. He knew the Lannisters were coming, but he also knew they had one advantage left, the element of surprise. "We hold this castle, no matter the cost," Robb said, his voice steady with determination. "We defend the north." With that, Robb, Arya, and Jon moved deeper into Riverrun, ready for whatever battle lay ahead. The night was thick with tension as Robb Stark, Jon Snow, Arya, and their men settled into position inside Riverrun's walls. The sound of the drawbridge creaking in the distance still echoed in Robb's mind as they prepared for the inevitable. They had taken the castle's eastern gate and now had limited time before the Lannisters realized their scouts had disappeared. Riverrun, though a formidable stronghold, would not hold forever against Tywin Lannister's forces if they weren't reinforced. Robb had no illusions about the dire situation they were in. The odds were against them, and every moment counted. "We don't have much time," Robb said as he surveyed the men around him, each of them tense, their hands resting on their weapons, their eyes darting nervously between the walls and the dark horizon. "Get to the battlements. We need eyes on." "The horizon. Stay sharp." Jon nodded in acknowledgement, his expression focused. "We'll be ready, Robb, but we need to send a message out to the north. If we're going to hold this castle, we need reinforcements. We can't keep it by ourselves." Robb paused. The north was far, and the war had already stretched his resources. Finn, his bannermen were scattered, many fighting their own battles against the Lannisters, or busy securing their territories. It was a difficult position, but Robb knew the stakes. If Riverrun fell, it would be a devastating blow to the north, and it would shift the balance of power in the war entirely. "I'll write a letter to the other houses," Robb said finally, "but it may take time for word to reach them. We hold as long as we can." Jon clasped his arm. "We'll make it count." "You've led us well, Robb." Robb nodded, taking a deep breath. He didn't feel like a leader, not now, not when every decision felt like it could be their last. But Jon's words were a reminder of the trust his men had in him, and he could not afford to let them down as the men took up their positions on the walls. Robb, Jon, and Arya made their way to the keep's interior. They needed to strengthen their position, fortify the doors, and ensure that everyone was prepared for a siege. Their numbers were small, but they had one advantage. They knew the castle, its tunnels, its corridors, and its secret chambers. They would use every bit of that knowledge to hold off the Lannisters for as long as possible. Meanwhile, Arya, who had not said much since entering the castle, moved with purpose. She had her eyes set on the armory. It was clear that she had grown beyond the little girl Robb had once known. She was a force in her own right now, not just someone who needed protection, but someone capable of taking action in her own way. "Where are you going?" Robb asked her as she made her way toward the armory. Arya turned to face him, her eyes glinting with determination. "I'm going to help. We're not going to sit here and wait for the Lannisters to break through. I'm not the same as I was before, Robb. I can fight." Robb hesitated, but he could see that no words would change her mind. She had always been fiercely independent, and he knew better than to try and stop her now. He had seen the fire in her before. "Just be careful," he said, his voice softening. "I'll need you with me when the battle comes." Arya nodded. "I'll be ready." As Arya disappeared into the shadows of the castle, Robb turned back to Jon, who was looking out toward the walls. "We need to prepare ourselves for the worst," Robb said grimly. "Tywin won't give up Riverrun easily. He's too smart for that." Jon met his gaze, his eyes steely. "Then I'll make it costly for him." With Jon at his side, Robb began to organize their defenses. They sent word to the castle's few remaining defenders, instructing them to fortify positions on the walls and reinforce the gate. Every available weapon was distributed, and preparations were made to defend the keep at all costs. Hours passed. In silence, the night seemed to stretch endlessly as the men took their positions, the low murmurs of their voices the only sounds that filled the otherwise still castle. Robb stood at the head of the main hall, a map of the area spread out before him. His mind raced with calculations, timing, strategy, positioning. Every detail mattered. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten, but it wasn't the sun that Robb feared now. It was the sound of hooves in the distance. Tywin's army had arrived. The castle's outer defenses were first to hear the sounds of Lannister soldiers gathering near the gates. Robb and his men rushed to their positions, Arya reappearing by his side, her sword drawn. She was ready for whatever was to come. "Stay close to me," Robb instructed, his eyes scanning the enemy's movements as they began to form ranks outside. "We'll make them pay for every inch of ground they take." From the battlements, Robb saw Tywin's forces assembling. They were numerous, far more than Robb's army could ever hope to match. But he wasn't about to surrender Riverrun without a fight. He knew this would be a bloody battle, and every man inside the castle would give everything they had to defend it. "We hold this castle. We hold it for the North," Robb said, his voice carrying over the ranks. His words weren't just for the men, but for himself. He needed to remind them, and himself, of why they were here. They weren't just fighting for land or power. They were fighting for family, for honor, for their way of life. The first arrows from the Lannisters flew over the walls, followed by the sound of their battering rams pounding against the gates. The assault had begun. "Brace yourselves," Robb shouted. "This is just the beginning." The walls of Riverrun shook as the Lannisters brought their siege engines to bear. Robb knew that they would not be able to hold the gates forever, but he also knew they didn't have to. They just had to survive long enough for help to arrive. Arya, standing beside him, looked up at him with a grim determination. "We'll fight until the end, won't we?" Robb smiled grimly. "Until the end." And with that, the battle began. The battle for Riverrun was a brutal one. The Lannisters, led by Tywin, had brought everything they could to bear against the fortress. The ground shook under the weight of the siege engines as battering rams relentlessly pounded the gates. The sound of distant war horns echoed through the air, and the men inside the castle braced for the onslaught. Robb stood at the front, his heart pounding with every strike against the gate. He watched as his men took their positions, arrows flying from the battlements and spears piercing the air as they held the walls against the encroaching army. The tension was palpable. Arya was by his side, her expression determined, and Jon. Snow stood ready beside them, his eyes scanning for weaknesses in the enemy's line. "Get ready," Robb said, his voice steady. The battle was on the edge of chaos. The moment they breach the gates, we fight like wolves. We fight for each other. Jon nodded, his sword in hand, his face set with the same resolve Robb had come to expect from him. Arya, ever the fierce one, clenched her dagger tightly and nodded in silent agreement. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet certainty that they would not go down without a fight. The Lannisters' siege weapons continued their brutal work, hammering against the gates, shaking the stone walls with each strike. The men inside Riverrun could hear the rattling of the doors, feel the reverberations in their bones. But they held fast, refusing to yield. Every inch they gave, they would make the Lannisters pay for it. Then, with a deafening crack, the gate finally gave way. The massive wooden doors splintered as the battering ram struck home for the final time. Dust and debris exploded into the air, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Robb's heart stopped for a brief moment, but his training kicked in immediately. "Hold your ground," Robb yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not let them in without blood." The Lannisters flooded into the courtyard like a wave, their soldiers pouring through the broken gates, shields raised, swords drawn. They were well equipped and numerous, but they would not have the castle without paying for it in blood. Jon and Robb's forces responded swiftly. Arrows rained down from the battlements, striking down the first wave of Lannisters before they could gain any ground. The sound of steel clashing against steel filled the air as Robb's men rushed forward to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The narrow corridors of Riverrun gave them some advantage. No matter how large Tywin's forces were, they would not be able to bring their full strength into the castle at once. Arya darted past Robb, her movements swift and sure. She had learned to fight with a cold precision, striking down anyone who came too close. Robb's heart swelled with pride as he saw her in action. She was no longer the scared little girl he had once tried to protect. She was a warrior in her own right. She moved through the enemy ranks like a shadow, her dagger flashing as she took down one soldier after another. Robb, meanwhile, was engaged in his own brutal fight, his sword clashing against the armor of Lannister soldiers. Each swing was heavy with the weight of responsibility. His men fought with a desperation born from knowing what would happen if they lost this battle. Riverrun was more than a fortress. It was a symbol. If it fell, so too would the hope of the North. And Robb knew that his people would never forgive him if he failed. The battle raged on for what felt like hours. The walls of Riverrun were stained with blood, the cries of the wounded and dying filling the air. Robb's men were brave, but they were growing weary. He could see it in their eyes, the relentless push of Tywin's army, the weight of the siege wearing them down. And still, the Lannisters came, wave after wave. Suddenly, Jon, who had been fighting fiercely at Robb's side, called out, "Robb!" "Look!" Robb's gaze shifted to the far side of the castle, where a new force was coming into view, reinforcements. Robb's heart leaped. They had done it. His bannermen, led by House Mormont, had answered his call. The tides of battle shifted. As the reinforcements poured in, rushing to the gates with the same fury as Robb's original force. With the new strength on their side, Robb's men fought harder, more fiercely than ever. The Lannisters, momentarily caught off guard by the arrival of fresh troops, began to falter. The battle which had once seemed like a losing effort, was turning in their favor. Robb, Jon, and Arya rallied their men, pushing back the enemy with renewed vigor. Tywin Lannister's forces were beginning to retreat, and Robb could feel the first stirrings of victory in the air. But the battle wasn't over yet. Robb knew that Tywin would never leave without exacting his own measure of revenge. It was no doubt that this was just the beginning of a long, bitter struggle. But for now, Riverrun held. Robb stood tall, looking over the battlefield, his sword dripping with the blood of Lannister soldiers. The walls of Riverrun would remain intact for the time being, and they had won the day. The North had proven its strength, and Robb Stark had earned his place. As their leader, Arya approached him, her face smeared with the blood of their enemies. "We've done it, Robb," she said quietly, her eyes fierce but filled with relief. "We held them off." Robb nodded, wiping the sweat and blood from his brow. "For now, we have. But Tywin will return, and when he does, we'll be ready." Jon stood beside them, his sword at his side, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "We can't stop now. The war is far from over." Robb looked at both of them, the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders. He had won a battle, but the war was far from done. And no matter how many victories they had, it would never be enough until they saw the end of the Lannister threat. "We fight until the last," Robb said, his voice filled with the determination of a leader who would not surrender. "We fight for the North." The dawn after the battle was filled with a strange silence. The fields surrounding Riverrun were littered with the fallen, the stench of blood and death heavy in the air. Robb Stark stood at the edge of the castle, his eyes sweeping over the remnants of the fight. His heart was still racing, the adrenaline of the battle still fresh in his veins. But as the sun rose, the weight of victory settled on him. They had held Riverrun. Against the odds, they had beaten Tywin Lannister's assault. But at what cost? The ground was soaked, and the walls of Riverrun had been marred by the brutal siege. Robb's men were tired, their faces grim with exhaustion. There were no celebrations. They had fought for their lives, and many had paid the price for it. Even with reinforcements arriving just in time to turn the tide, Robb knew this victory had only bought them a short respite. The war wasn't over, and the Lannisters would soon return with more soldiers, more strength. "We did it," Jon Snow said as he joined Robb, his eyes scanning the battlefield. His voice was a mix of relief and exhaustion. "But we can't hold Riverrun forever, not with the forces Tywin can gather. We need a plan." Robb nodded grimly. "I know. But for now, Riverrun is still ours. And we will take what time we can to prepare. The North won't abandon us. Not after this." Jon didn't respond immediately, his eyes distant, as if processing everything that had happened. Then he turned to Robb, his expression serious. "Tywin won't give up. He'll want to reclaim Riverrun. And once he does, we'll be exposed. The South has too many soldiers, and we can't keep fighting with nothing but desperation on our side." "I'm aware of that," Robb replied, his voice taut with determination. "But we can't back down. The North can't afford to lose. We're going to make our stand here, Jon. It's our best chance." Robb had never been more aware of how dire the situation was. The Lannisters were formidable, and Tywin was a strategic genius. But Robb knew that if he faltered, the North would fall. That thought pushed him onward, keeping him grounded amidst the carnage of battle. Meanwhile, Arya stood nearby, her face still stained with the blood of the men she had killed. She had fought fiercely, just as Robb had expected. She was no longer a child, she was a warrior in every sense of the word. Robb saw her approach, her eyes as focused as ever. "We need to think ahead," Arya said, her voice low but sharp. "Riverrun's defenses are strong, but we can't keep waiting for Tywin to hit us again. We need to take the fight to him. If we strike now, While he's regrouping, we can hit his weak spots." Robb raised an eyebrow. "You want us to leave Riverrun vulnerable? We don't have the men to march on his army." Arya's eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "If we don't do something, we'll just be sitting ducks. We've got to act while Tywin's distracted by the loss. There's no point in waiting for him to come back in full force." Jon stepped forward, clearly impressed by Arya's thinking. "She's right, Robb. If we wait too long, we'll lose our chance. We can't just sit here waiting to be attacked." Robb took a moment to consider their words. Both Arya and Jon made valid points. They were sitting on a tactical advantage right now. But was it enough to risk leaving Riverrun and pursuing Tywin's forces? Was it worth the gamble? Finally, Robb looked at Jon and Arya. He saw the determination in their eyes, the same determination that had carried them through the battle. He knew that the North could not afford to wait. If they did, Tywin would eventually crush them. "We can't afford to wait," Robb said firmly. "We'll send word to our bannermen to rally their forces and reinforce us. Meanwhile, we'll hit Tywin's army hard, force him to retreat. We take the fight to him while we still have the element of surprise. We can't afford to give him the time he needs to regroup." Jon nodded. "We can't leave Riverrun undefended. We'll have to leave a small force to hold the gates while the rest of us march." Arya smirked, already eager for the battle ahead. "Let's make sure Tywin regrets ever thinking he could take this castle." Robb gave her a small smile, but his face was still serious. "We'll need all our men to be ready. This will be a swift attack, and we can't afford to be caught off guard." As the men began preparing for the next stage of their campaign, Robb realized that this war was only getting more dangerous. Tywin Lannister was cunning, ruthless, and capable of anything. Robb knew that this fight would be one of the hardest he would face, but the North was behind him. Every step he took now would be for them, for his family, for his people, for the survival of the North. Word was sent out to the surrounding houses, urging them to rally at Riverrun. Robb knew that the North would respond. His bannermen had always been loyal, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The time for waiting was over. Tywin Lannister's forces would soon learn that the North had teeth, and they would not yield so easily. With the preparations in motion, Robb stood at the top of Riverrun's keep, looking out over the riverlands. The water flowed steadily below, reflecting the pale light of the setting sun. It was a peaceful sight, but Robb knew that peace was a luxury they couldn't afford. "We'll do whatever it takes to hold the North," Robb muttered to himself, the words spoken more to his own heart than to anyone else. "We'll fight until there's nothing left." The winds of war howled across the land, but Robb Stark's resolve was unwavering. The North would endure. They had to. The days following Robb's decision to take the fight to Tywin Lannister were filled with preparations. As Riverrun recovered from the siege, Robb's forces worked tirelessly to fortify the castle's remaining defenses. The smell of sweat and the echo of hammering echoed through the air as soldiers, both veterans and fresh recruits, reinforced the battlements and secured the gates. In the meantime, the message had been sent, and Robb knew it would only be a matter of days before reinforcements arrived. Yet, as the sun sank behind the hills, Robb could not shake the sense of unease gnawing at him. Every movement, every decision, weighed heavily on him. He had always been a soldier, but the weight of leadership was different. It was not just about strategy. It was about his family, his people, and the survival of everything he held dear. The consequences of every misstep would be felt not just by him, but by the North itself. Jon Snow, as always, was at Robb's side. He had been an unshakable presence throughout the siege, his loyalty never in question. Robb had come to rely on Jon, not only as a brother in arms, but as a reminder of the Stark values he was fighting to preserve. The war was larger than any one person, but with Jon by his side, Robb felt like he had someone who understood the true stakes. As they surveyed the battlefield one last time before the march, Jon spoke up. "It's a risk, Robb. We don't have the numbers to engage Tywin head-on. The Lannisters will have fortified positions by now, and their strength is far superior to ours. We can't underestimate them." Robb's eyes narrowed, and he clenched his jaw. "I know, Jon, but we can't let them dictate the pace of this war. If we wait for them to come for us again, we'll be caught off guard. We strike before they're ready, or we risk losing everything." Jon didn't respond immediately. He knew the risks just as well as Robb did, but he also understood the dire need for action. Sometimes a leader had to make decisions that didn't come with guarantees. "You're right," Jon said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "If we're going to fight, it has to be now. We need to hit them hard, fast, and then pull back before they can regroup." Robb nodded, turning his gaze toward the horizon where Tywin's army was likely encamped. The next move would be theirs, and it had to be swift. The battle ahead would not be a simple skirmish. It would determine the course of the war. That night, Robb convened a council of his most trusted bannermen, including Jon, and discussed the plan of attack. The strategy was simple yet dangerous. They would move out under the cover of darkness, crossing the Riverlands with a small force. They would target Tywin's weakest point, his supply line, forcing him to stretch his forces thin. The element of surprise was their only advantage, and they had to make it count. Arya, always eager for action, had joined the council without invitation. Robb could see the restlessness in her eyes, the desire to prove herself. She had grown, too accustomed to the battlefield and the harsh realities of war to sit idly by. She wasn't going to be left behind, not when she had already proven herself on the front lines. "I'm going with you," Arya said bluntly, as she stared at Robb with an unyielding gaze. Robb met her eyes. "You've already fought enough. Arya, we can't risk you being exposed." Her lips pressed together, and she stood straighter. "I'm not a child anymore. I can fight, and I want to be there with you. You know I'm ready." Robb hesitated for a moment, but he saw in her the same fierceness he had witnessed in the battle at Riverrun. She had been a warrior long before this moment, and though he hated to admit it, Arya was no longer the little sister he had once vowed to protect. She was a force of her own. "All right," Robb finally said, his voice calm, "but stay close. If we're going to do this, we do it together." Arya nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We'll win this, Robb. We'll make them pay for what they did." With the plan in place, they moved quickly through the night, their force small but nimble. They crossed the Riverlands under the cover of darkness, making their way toward Tywin's camp. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale shadows on the forest floor. The quiet hum of their horses' hooves was the only sound that accompanied them. The journey took the better part of a day, but by dawn they had reached their destination. Tywin's camp was not far from the Riverland's outskirts, just beyond a thicket of trees. Robb's men moved silently, positioning themselves along the edges of the camp. Tywin's forces were still unaware of their presence. Jon, Arya, and Robb crept forward, their steps measured and deliberate. The air was thick with tension. As they neared the heart of the camp, Robb could see the supply wagons unprotected and vulnerable, just as they had anticipated. The Lannisters had stretched their forces thin, and it had left a gap in their defenses. Now was their moment. "On my signal," Robb whispered to his men, his hand tightening around his sword. With one final nod, he gave the signal. The attack was swift, an explosion of sound, as his men charged forward, cutting through the camp like wolves among sheep. The Lannisters, taken by surprise, scrambled to organize their defense, but it was too late. Robb's men tore through, their ranks striking down any who got in their way. Arya was a blur in the chaos, darting between soldiers with deadly precision, her dagger flashing as she cut down Lannisters left and right. Robb could hear the cries of the enemy soldiers, but his focus remained on the supply wagons. They had to destroy them, break Tywin's lines, and force him to retreat. The fire set to the wagons burned brightly, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. The supply lines were in flames, and Tywin's forces were thrown into disarray. Robb knew they couldn't stay long. This was a hit-and-run mission, and they had to vanish before the enemy had time to retaliate. "Fall back," Robb shouted, his voice cutting through the smoke and chaos. "We've done what we came for. Fall back to the trees." With the flames of the burning wagons lighting their way, Robb and his forces quickly withdrew, disappearing into the thickets as the sounds of the battle faded behind them. They had struck Tywin hard, and now they would disappear, leaving him to pick up the pieces. Back in the forest, Robb's heart still raced with the thrill of the attack. They had disrupted Tywin's plans, but this victory was only a small part of the greater war. As they made their way back to Riverrun, Robb couldn't help but feel the weight of the coming battles. There was still much to be done, and the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Robb allowed himself a small moment of hope. The North wasn't finished yet.